From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Not that long ago, some doctors would use lobotomies as a treatment for mental illness or insomnia or severe headaches. That wouldn't happen now, but modern medicine has made some weird, often tragic turns to get to where it is now. Similarly, our guest today argues that our modern roads are designed with what amounts to junk science, and he says it's time for a wake-up call. Wesley Marshall teaches civil engineering at the University of Colorado, Denver. He thinks the way our streets and highways are designed contributes to tens of thousands of unnecessary crashes and deaths each year. Wes Marshall recently published his research and ideas in a book provocatively titled Killed by a Traffic Engineer. He spoke with In The NoCo's Brad Turner shortly after the book came out. We're listening back to that conversation in the third installment of our Holiday Book Club.
So, Wes, how are traffic engineers similar to doctors performing lobotomies?
Like the fatality rate on those lobotomies was, I think 35%. And
wow.
But that was even not that long ago. But and when I start the book off, I talk about the fact that doctors have been around for 5,000 years. I mean, for the first 1,000, they were trying, but it wouldn't be hard to argue that they killed more people than they saved. Traffic engineering, transportation engineering is really only about 100 years old. And what I'm saying is we're sort of still in those early phases where we're trying. We need to make it more of an empirical science, but we're still in a phase where we're killing more people than we saved, similar to those early doctors.
People place a lot of trust in traffic engineers to design safe roads, if they think about it at all. How much is the work of traffic engineers backed up by science?
Well, I think it's tricky because the traffic engineers truly believe that it is. And the same thing with me. When I was a young traffic engineer, you're handed all these 1,000-page manuals and you assume whoever wrote them knows more than I do. You assume that there's 100 years of science behind them, and we assume that they did their homework. And it's hard because I don't think many traffic engineers today know that there isn't much science behind it. Like at the time, yeah, that research made sense for then, but it does not extrapolate 10, 20, 100 years into the future. But we're still sort of using some of those early references and early reasons as to why we do things today.
What's a simple example of that? What's a fundamental concept that's sort of easy to understand for a layperson that speaks to things where it's based on a bad assumption and we need to fix it?
I was always taught that wider roads are safer. And if the idea is that, if you give somebody a narrow road and a wide road, and if they behave the exact same way, they're going to be safer on the wider road because there's more of a factor of safety. They can not pay attention for a second and kind of go off the road and not hit a tree and not hit something else. Like they'll be safer. But we also know that human behavior shifts depending on what's put in front of us. So people end up driving faster on the wider road, and then our outcomes end up being worse. But the idea perpetuated that these wider roads are safer, and we sort of never went back to check to see if that was right. And it turns out it's not right, but we're still kind of stuck in that mentality that is how we design safer places. And when you really think about it, it doesn't make sense when humans are involved.
Wes, if I had to summarize your book's argument, I might say it's to stop prioritizing speed and convenience for motorists over prioritizing walkable, bikeable transportation. I think officials in cities like Denver and Boulder and Fort Collins would say they're already doing that. What do you say about that argument?
All of our protocols that we have for designing streets, for designing the transportation system in general, still uses those same things. So yes, we are making headways. Yes, the streets out here in Denver and Fort Collins and places like that have come a long way, but they're still not prioritizing safety. Not even just safety for pedestrians or bicyclists, but safety for everybody. Like they're prioritizing getting people through a spot instead of to a spot. They're prioritizing speed. They're prioritizing capacity of cars. So it is really more of a shift to safety and safety for everybody.
There's a passage in your book that describes a campaign of billboard advertisements from the Colorado Department of Transportation. The billboards encourage drivers to keep their eyes on the road. Why does this campaign irritate you?
So I think just the idea that we should be putting our safety money into education. Like we know that it doesn't work. The research shows that there's very little benefit from it. But I think the bigger, more fundamental problem is that all our crash data is telling us we have a huge human error problem. And I'm not by any means trying to let folks off the hook for bad behavior on the roads. But if you actually think about a lot of the cases we have that would be blamed on human error, it's the driver's fault or maybe a pedestrian's fault. And to me, it's the engineer's fault. This needs to be fixed with engineering. But instead, we put up a billboard that says you need to make eye contact with the driver and the pedestrian. And it takes the focus off sort of the real fundamental problems we have with the transportation system and puts it more on, to some extent, victim blaming.
Can you engineer or expect traffic engineers to engineer accidents out of a world where, drivers are human, pedestrians are human, and humans make mistakes?
Well, so much of what we see in terms of crashes are predictable. And if it's predictable, I feel like it's preventable. And we can do things with engineering to reduce it. So, if we design a big wide road and put up a sign that says 30 miles an hour and somebody speeds on it, yes, we blame them for speeding. Yes, that gets chalked up as a human error crash, but we could easily design a more self-enforcing road to make it hard to speed, to make the speed limit sort of match what the built environment is like, but we often don't. And then it removes that feedback loop where engineers have no reason to think there's even anything wrong because all our data is telling us that we have a terrible human error problem, and we put our money into education and enforcement instead.
There's another campaign also from CDOT that you talk about in the book where people wearing giant eyeballs on their heads walked around downtown Denver to encourage pedestrians to make eye contact with drivers before stepping into a crosswalk. Tell us about your reaction to that campaign.
And that's good advice, but it's the kind of good advice that should be coming from like me to my kids, right? Like I tell my kids to, but if you put it out there as from like a state DOT or any sort of major agency like that, it feels like it's sending the wrong message. Like it's my responsibility as a pedestrian, like to make sure the driver is obeying the law. And yes, it's sort of generally good advice, but what about the 12 million people in this country that have visual impairment, or the 1.2 million people that are blind? If they get hit, is it their fault because they couldn't make eye contact with the driver? And that isn't the right message. And I feel like we can do better. We can actually make these crosswalks safer, actually make it much more difficult for a driver not to stop at them. So that's sort of my big picture thinking, is like we're sort of putting our eggs in the wrong basket, and we need to focus more on what we can do to design safer streets.
Traffic engineers are dedicated people. What's the reaction been like to this book?
There's a spectrum of responses to it.
Okay.
On one hand, there's so many engineers that also feel like there's something wrong. They feel like what they're doing, doesn't really add up. So I do feel like there's a big group of engineers that were waiting for this. So they want this, and they've soaked it up really quickly. There's a smaller group that is calling for me to resign from certain transportation engineering organizations, but they're also refusing to read the book in the first place. So to me, they're almost proving my point that we're not going to get better if we keep sticking our heads in the sand.
That was In The NoCo's Brad Turner talking with Wesley Marshall about his new book, Killed by a Traffic Engineer. You'll find all of our favorite author interviews of 2024 at our website, KUNC.org. That's it today for In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.